I had been patrolling the northern stretch of the Blue Ridge for nearly a decade by the time I first heard it, a sound so subtle I almost mistook it for the wind. I remember thinking it was just the usual rustle of the pines, a familiar song carried by the autumn breeze, but there was a rhythm to it that didn't belong to nature. At first I dismissed it. Rangers hear things out here all the time, branches snapping under the weight of a falling limb, a distant owl, the restless shuffle of deer. But this wasn't ordinary. It had cadence, almost words, a pattern I couldn't make sense of. I slowed my pace, scanning the dimming light between the trees. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew sharper, carrying a deliberate urgency that made the hairs on my neck prickle. I reached the edge of a small clearing, the forest darkening around me as the sun slipped beneath the ridge. The whispers seemed to come from every direction at once, circling me, weaving through the trees. I lifted my radio to call in, hoping to hear a familiar voice, something grounding, but it was useless, static, harsh, and unbroken. My own voice came back to me distorted, bouncing off the mountains in ways that made the words almost unrecognizable. I told myself it was the terrain, the radio interference, anything to rationalize what I was hearing. Still, as I moved deeper into the woods, the whispers pressed closer, forming fragments of sentences I could almost catch. Don't. Go. They. See. Stay. Here. Each fragment felt like it belonged to someone, or something, watching me, guiding me, warning me, and yet I could make no sense of it. I tried to stay on the marked trail, letting the worn dirt path guide me, but the forest seemed to conspire against me. Shadows stretched along the tree line, long and lean, slipping just beyond the edges of my flashlight. Every so often I thought I glimpsed a figure, a shape too human to be animal, too still to be alive. My chest tightened. I kept walking, telling myself it was exhaustion, that I was imagining things after months of back-to-back patrols. But even rational thoughts couldn't dismiss the sense of being followed. The whispers were patient. They never rushed, never screamed, just moved with me, circling my campfire when I stopped to rest, threading through the darkness like smoke. By nightfall, I had set up camp in a narrow hollow I knew from previous patrols. The fire threw long, shaky shadows, and I could hear the whispers clearly now, even over the crackling of the wood. They didn't speak in words I could understand, just syllables and tones that seemed alive, urgent, pleading. I tried to convince myself it was a fox or some other creature echoing through the trees, but the pattern, the rhythm, it wasn't natural. Every so often I felt a breeze on the back of my neck, not from the wind, but from something moving too close, too deliberate. I checked the perimeter, flashlight sweeping in slow arcs, but the forest appeared empty. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion began to gnaw at me. I crawled into my tent, hoping the fabric walls would provide some sense of safety, but the whispers followed. They seemed to inhabit the very air inside the tent, moving over me, under me, circling until I could almost feel their presence pressing against my chest. Shadows slid across the thin walls of the tent, and for a moment I was sure I could see them. Faces pale and indistinct, watching, waiting. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, the rhythm returned, a heartbeat in the dark that belonged to something older than the mountains themselves. Time lost meaning. The night stretched on, the whispering never ceasing, until a faint glow at the horizon told me the sun had begun to rise. With daylight, the forest seemed less sinister, the shadows retreating into the familiar shapes of trees and rocks. The whispers faded, dissolving into the hum of the morning wind. I packed up quickly, moving down the ridge toward the next patrol point, but the memory lingered, etched into my mind like frost on a window pane. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every hollow echo between the peaks, seemed to carry the same cadence, the same rhythm that had haunted me through that night. Even now, years later, I remember how the forest seemed to breathe with a life beyond my understanding. The Blue Ridge is not a place for stories or tall tales. It's a living, breathing expanse of isolation, where the boundaries between what is seen and unseen blur when night falls. That night, I realized how small and fragile we are, how easily the forest can remind us that we're not truly alone. I never found the source of the whispers, and I don't think I want to. Some things I've learned are meant to remain unanswered. The mountains hold their secrets close, patient, and the echoes of that night, those rhythmic, urgent, incomprehensible whispers, follow me still, like shadows that refuse to leave, whispering of a presence I may never quite like the call I received one Friday afternoon. A local hiker, a man in his late 20s named Jeremy, reported seeing something off near Black Rock Gap. His voice had carried the kind of tension you only hear when someone's instincts scream danger, the kind of tension that sets your own stomach to twisting. I packed my gear quickly, grabbed my flashlight, radio, and field notebook, and drove to the trailhead where he had parked. The parking area was quiet, almost too quiet for a weekend afternoon. His car still sat there, doors locked, but no sign of him. I double-checked with the small local ranger station via radio, letting them know I was heading in to investigate. The signal was weak up there, crackling over the static, but I could hear the faint hum of the ridge behind me. I followed the trail Jeremy had described, a narrow path twisting into a dense canopy that swallowed much of the remaining daylight. The deeper I went, the more the forest closed in, each tree a sentry leaning inward, branches tangling overhead until sunlight became fragmented, filtered into strange, uneven shafts. I moved slowly, careful not to disturb anything, listening to the usual sounds of the forest, the distant call of a hawk, the rustle of leaves under small creatures' feet. But there was a stillness too, a quiet that made me pause. My boots crunched on the dirt trail, yet it felt as if I were intruding into a space that wasn't meant for me. Then I saw the backpack. It was lying near the edge of a steep ravine, abandoned, the straps twisted and mud-streaked. I knelt beside it, checking the contents without touching more than necessary. A water bottle, a half-empty bag of trail mix, and a small first aid kit. Nothing seemed out of place, yet my gut screamed otherwise. Surrounding the pack, I noticed strange markings carved into the trees, shallow and uneven, as though someone, or something, had hurriedly left them. Lines, scratches, symbols I couldn't name. I radioed in the location, requesting backup. Static answered me again, distorted and distant, as though the mountains themselves were swallowing my voice. I continued along the path, looking for Jeremy's footprints. At first I found them, a clear trail of boot imprints pressed into damp earth, the occasional scuff where he had stumbled over roots. But the trail stopped suddenly, just ended. No prints beyond a certain point. I checked the ravine, the underbrush, even the rocks along the trail. Nothing, not a single mark. The trail had vanished as if he had stepped into thin air. I called his name, my voice echoing off the ridge and quickly swallowed by the dense forest, but no answer came. A chill ran down my spine, not from the cold, but from a rising, creeping sense of wrongness. The fog rolled in as evening approached, low and thick, spilling over the slopes and curling around the trees. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. I set up a temporary marker with some survey tape and continued slowly, my flashlight piercing only a few feet ahead. Then I heard it. A faint, distant cry, so small I almost didn't register it at first. It didn't sound like any human voice I had ever heard, high-pitched, wavering, yet urgent. I froze. The cry echoed again, this time closer, as if following me through the fog. I called out again, but there was no response beyond the echo of my own voice. Every instinct I had told me to turn back, to leave, but something compelled me forward, an uneasy sense that I needed to see, to understand what had happened to Jeremy. Hours passed as I followed the terrain, moving carefully along narrow ridges and dense thickets. Shadows formed at the edges of my vision, fleeting and impossible to focus on. Every time I glanced toward them, there was nothing. Just tree trunks, rocks, and the fog swirling over the slopes. I reached a clearing near a small stream, its water black and still, reflecting nothing but the gray sky above. And then I saw the footprints again. They appeared suddenly on the muddy bank, half-formed, as though the earth had somehow remembered a passage and then immediately forgotten it. I followed them upstream, tracing each mark with trembling hands, feeling a cold sweat gather at my temples. The footprints ended once more, abruptly, vanishing at the base of an old fallen tree that lay across the bank like a barrier. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps Jeremy had slipped into the water and carried downstream. Perhaps he had panicked and wandered off into the thick underbrush. But the markings on the trees, the strange pauses in the trail, the way the fog seemed to press in on me, It didn't feel natural. It felt deliberate, as if the forest itself was watching, guiding me, waiting. I called for backup again, repeating his name, but the radio responded with nothing but static and distant, indistinguishable moaning. I remembered the stories I had heard as a younger ranger, tales of hikers disappearing without trace, whispers in the fog, trails that led nowhere, but I had always thought of them as folklore. Now I couldn't. There was a real pressing dread, something that grounded itself in the physicality of the forest while remaining entirely unknowable. The night fell fully, bringing with it the black velvet of the mountains. I found a small ledge to sit on, my flashlight scanning the ridge, beam darting over trees, roots, and fog. I thought I heard movement behind me, soft, deliberate steps that didn't match any rhythm of the wildlife around. I turned, shining the light through the thick mist, but the trail remained empty. The fog seemed heavier now, curling around my legs and moving like liquid. My own breath sounded loud, uneven, echoing strangely off the distant cliffs. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was nerves, the stress of searching, the isolation. But every instinct screamed danger. I decided to set up a temporary camp for the night, though sleep felt impossible. My mind replayed every detail, the sudden vanishing of footprints, the backpack abandoned with its eerie carvings, the cries in the fog. Shadows moved at the periphery of my vision, slinking from one tree to another just beyond the reach of the light. I felt a presence that was patient, silent, as though it had been waiting for me to arrive all along. I kept my flashlight close, scanning continuously, but no matter where I looked, I could never fully dispel the sense of eyes upon me, watching from the fog and darkness alike. Somewhere in the early hours, I thought I heard Jeremy's voice, soft, strained, almost a whisper calling my name. I froze. The voice was human enough to be recognizable, but it carried a strange quality, warped, distorted, carried along the wind and fog. I called back, but my own voice sounded wrong, like it had bounced off unseen walls and returned altered. I could hear nothing else, only the quiet hum of the forest and the occasional snap of a branch, distant but deliberate. I stayed awake. The entire night, flashlight in hand, my ears straining for any sound that would give me direction, clarity, an explanation. Dawn finally broke, and with the light, the forest seemed less menacing, less sentient. The fog receded, leaving dew-soaked leaves and damp earth. I walked slowly back toward the trailhead, marking my path carefully. Nothing of Jeremy remained. The backpack, the markings, the trail, it all stayed behind, untouched, impenetrable, a puzzle that offered no answers. When I reached my vehicle, I radioed in the situation, and my team arrived later to comb the area. They reported strange noises, more cries, some almost like whispers, none human, echoing through the ridges and hollows. We searched for days but found nothing. No trace of Jeremy, no further clues, just the same strange markings on trees, the same unnatural quiet that had pressed against me the night before. I have walked that ridge many times since, alone and with other rangers, but the memory of that day lingers. The forest feels different in places, the trees taller, the shadows longer, the fog heavier, as if it remembers, as if it waits. I often hear whispers when the wind shifts just right, fragments of words carried from somewhere deep in the mountains. I have learned to respect the space, to move slowly, and never to assume that the trails, the signs, the paths are as they appear. Black Rock Gap holds its secrets close, patient and indifferent. Jeremy's disappearance was not dramatic, not violent in a way that makes headlines. It was quiet, deliberate, incomprehensible, and it left a mark that no time, no experience can erase. The mountains watch, the trees remember, and somewhere in the fog, the ridge waits for the next person who dares to step too far into its shadow. I had been patrolling the old ranger routes for nearly a decade, tracing paths that rarely saw human traffic anymore. Most of the trails had long since been reclaimed by the forest, the dirt paths twisting under fallen branches, the markers faded or gone. One morning, I decided to check a hollow I hadn't walked in years. a low, narrow valley where the trees grew thick and the canopy swallowed sunlight like it didn't belong. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine, and as I followed the winding trail, the silence around me pressed close. Birds called occasionally, and the scurry of small animals echoed faintly. But there was a stillness here unlike any I had encountered elsewhere, a quiet that seemed deliberate, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. I rounded a bend in the trail and froze. Tucked into a curve of the hollow was a cabin, dilapidated but intact. It wasn't on any map I had, and when I checked my GPS, the coordinates didn't match anything recorded. I even recalled looking at land records last month during a paperwork review. There was no owner listed for this property, and yet here it was, sitting as though it had been waiting for me all along. Its wooden exterior was weathered, darkened by years of sun and rain, shingles missing from the roof, moss crawling up the sides. The door, slightly ajar, creaked faintly in the wind. It felt alive, not in the way a building hums with electricity, but as though it had awareness. I hesitated, hand resting on my flashlight, the beam slicing through the shadowed doorway. The air smelled cold, damp, and something else I couldn't name. Something old and musty, mixed with a hint of smoke. The door opened farther with the merest touch of the wind, revealing the interior. It was furnished. Chairs, a small table, a simple stove, all arranged as if someone had just stepped out. Dust covered the surfaces, but the items weren't disturbed. A faint echo of habitation lingered in the air. I called out softly, "Hello?" But no answer came. Only the distant sound of the forest returned my voice, warped and hollow. I stepped inside cautiously, my boots creaking against the wooden floorboards. I felt eyes on me immediately. Not just a sense of being watched, but the unmistakable pressure of observation. My pulse quickened. I scanned the room, and for a moment, I could have sworn a figure flitted across the far wall, vanishing before I could focus. Then I heard it, faint footsteps above, slow and deliberate, pacing. I froze. There was no attic hatch visible from below, and the stairs to any upper floor had long since collapsed in some spots, yet the sound continued. I called out again, louder this time, my voice echoing off the walls. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. I left the cabin to continue my patrol, setting up camp nearby on a flat patch of earth beside a small stream. That night, sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the sounds of the forest, which seemed louder and stranger than usual. Around midnight, I swore I could hear the cabin itself moving, the faint groan of timber stretching, shadows crawling across the walls in ways impossible for the dim firelight outside to create. I strained to hear, every sense heightened. Footsteps above, soft and deliberate, then a whisper, almost too quiet to discern, brushing the edge of my consciousness. The wind carried faint murmurs, indecipherable but urgent. I gripped my flashlight, staring at the cabin from across the clearing. Its windows glinted faintly, as though eyes were reflecting my gaze back at me. Hours passed. Every time I dared to blink, the shadows seemed to stretch farther, elongating unnaturally. The forest beyond my campfire seemed to press closer, each tree leaning inward, enclosing the hollow. Sleep was impossible. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the sounds and movements, old beams settling, wildlife, the imagination of a man alone in the mountains. But the cabin felt alive in a way no building should. Its presence was oppressive, patient, as if it was aware of me watching, aware of my intrusion. By morning, the sun was barely cresting the ridge when I decided to approach the cabin again, determined to get a clearer look. But when I arrived, the hollow was empty. No cabin, no door, no windows, no signs that any structure had ever stood there at all. The ground was flat and undisturbed, the forest floor littered with leaves and pine needles as if untouched for decades. I stumbled backward, convinced my mind had played a cruel trick, but the memory of the interior, the furniture, the steps, and the shadows was vivid, unshakable. My camera, which I had not turned on inside, had nothing to show. It was as if the cabin had existed only for me, only in that night of isolation. I returned to the ranger station, shaken but silent. I've patrolled these mountains for years, seen many things that would unsettle most people, but the hollow and that cabin remain etched in my mind. I've returned to the trail numerous times, alone and with colleagues, and never once has the cabin appeared again. The trees in that hollow are normal, the forest quiet, but something about the space feels suspended. Time feels different there, slowed, heavy. Footsteps echo strangely, shadows seem just slightly off, and for a moment, if you stand perfectly still, the air itself feels like it's watching. Some nights, I can still picture it. The cold, the silence, the furniture arranged as if someone had just left for the day. The creak of the door opening without touch. The faint footsteps above, pacing endlessly. The shadows stretching across the walls, moving in ways the firelight shouldn't allow. Even now, when I patrol nearby trails, I feel that hollow drawing me back, a magnetic pull of unease. The cabin might never reappear, yet it lives vividly in my memory, a place where the rules of the world felt suspended, where the mountains themselves seemed to bend around some secret I will never fully comprehend. I have tried to tell colleagues about it, cautious about the details, but most dismiss it as an overactive imagination, exhaustion, the result of years walking alone through dense, silent forest. Yet every time I describe it, I notice the change in them, the pause, the slight tension in their bodies, as though they too can feel the weight of that hollow from a distance. I do not know how a structure can appear, exist, and vanish entirely, leaving only memory behind. I do not know if I was alone, or if something else had been inside the cabin with me, observing, waiting. I do not know if the forest itself has some consciousness, some patient awareness, or if the hollow is simply a place where the world's rules loosen, revealing something older, something patient. Even today, I avoid that hollow when I can. The memory of it, of the cold, silent interior, the creaking steps above, the oppressive presence, remains with me, and I can feel it in the quiet moments, the still hours before dawn, when the forest is nearly silent. The mountains have taught me many lessons, but none as unnerving as this. Some places in the Blue Ridge are not meant to be mapped, not meant to be recorded. They exist beyond our understanding, only perceivable in fleeting glimpses, in moments when the forest allows a visitor to see something glimpsed, terrifying in its normalcy. That hollow, and the cabin that may or may not have existed, is one of those moments. Its memory is permanent, etched into my mind as though burned there by the fire of something entirely unknown. I often wonder what I would have found if I had stayed inside the cabin longer, had dared to explore every shadowed corner. I wonder if Jeremy, or someone like him, had ever stumbled upon it, and if so, what became of them. The forest keeps its secrets well. The hollow is patient, and sometimes, when I walk by, the trees seem to shift ever so slightly, as if they remember, as if they are still aware of what once stood in that space, waiting for the next pair of eyes to glimpse something that should not exist. I have never spoken of it publicly, and I may never do so. But in the silence of the Blue Ridge, in the moments when the fog presses against the pines and the wind moves in unnatural ways, I can still feel the cabin's presence, waiting just beyond sight, reminding me that some things are better left unseen, and some hollows are meant to remain untouched by the living. The morning I patrolled Raven Creek, the fog was heavier than anything I had ever seen in those mountains. It rolled over the creek in thick, opaque layers, creeping along the banks like water made of smoke. Usually that time of year, the mornings were crisp but clear, the forest revealing its shapes and contours in soft light. But that day, visibility was near zero. Every sound was warped, echoing strangely, as though the creek, the trees, even the wind were listening and repeating in some distorted way. The crunch of my boots on the damp trail sounded far away, muffled, and the call of a distant bird was slowed, hollow, almost mechanical. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a premonition I tried to ignore as I continued along the path, flashlight cutting weakly through the white haze. I don't know how long I'd been walking when I first saw it. A figure, barely perceptible through the thick mist, standing just beyond the edge of the trail. It resembled a man, upright and still, yet its movements were wrong, unnatural. When it stepped forward, its foot slid across the ground, never truly landing. It made no sound, not even the rustle of leaves or the faintest snap of a twig. I called out, my voice loud in the dense fog. "Hello? Are you okay?" But the words seemed to vanish, swallowed by the mist before they reached the figure. I tried to move closer, but each time I thought I had narrowed the distance, it shifted impossibly, always just out of reach, slipping through the fog like smoke itself. Panic began to rise in my chest. I slowed my pace, keeping my flashlight low, trying not to draw attention, though I knew the fog had already claimed everything around me. My rational mind told me it must be a hunter, someone lost, maybe even a local pulling a prank. But my gut told me otherwise. The shape had no face, no discernible features, and yet the presence was deliberate and unblinking. Every step I took, it mirrored or anticipated my movements. I tried calling again, but the sound of my voice was strange, distorted, like it had bounced off invisible walls, returning to me warped. I stopped, listening to the silence that followed. Even the fog seemed to press close, curling around my legs, moving with a weight that was impossible for air alone. Hours passed. The figure would appear at the edge of visibility, a sliding shadow against the whiteness, and vanish when I thought I could reach it. I tried to track its path, turning sharply, scanning left and right, but the fog bent around it, hiding every detail. The creek beside me flowed silently, black and still beneath the shroud of mist, reflecting nothing but the gray sky above. Every so often I thought I heard whispers carried along the wind, low and distant, undecipherable yet urgent, as if the forest itself was speaking a language I could almost understand but never quite grasp. The trail twisted and turned, becoming less familiar the further I went. The fog seemed thicker in certain areas, denser, almost tactile, clinging to my clothing, my skin. Shapes emerged and dissolved in it, rocks, stumps, fallen logs, only to vanish when I blinked or turned my head. Shadows moved at the periphery of my vision, teasing the edges of recognition, never fully forming into anything tangible. My radio crackled intermittently with static, a weak signal struggling through the mist, but no one could hear me. My sense of time began to warp. The hours blurred, the trail looping in ways that made no sense, though I was certain I hadn't retraced my steps. At one point, I stumbled across a fallen tree spanning the path, and as I stepped around it, the figure was closer than ever. Its presence pressed against me, though I felt no air movement, no physical contact. I froze, heart hammering, my breath visible in the cold fog. I tried to look for details, any hint of its form, but it remained indistinct, a shadow of a human shape sliding through the mist. I shouted again, my voice breaking, demanding it speak, move, reveal itself, but nothing. Only the fog responded, curling thicker, twisting like a living thing around the tree trunks. I felt disoriented, the trail bending and turning in impossible ways, the canopy swallowing all light. The figure appeared again, at a distance that shouldn't have been possible, and I realized with a sinking heart that I wasn't following it. It was following me, guiding me deeper, shaping the path. Exhaustion began to set in, both mental and physical. My flashlight beam flickered weakly as if drained by the fog itself, and my boots sank slightly into the soft, wet ground. The forest, usually a source of solace, felt predatory. The sounds of wildlife had gone silent, leaving only my heartbeat and the faint murmur of the creek as company. I tried to mark the trail, leaving scratches on the trees, but the fog seemed to swallow them, erasing the signs almost immediately. For a moment I wondered if the forest was alive, aware of my presence and amused by my attempts to navigate it. I found a small clearing and tried to rest, sitting on a mossy rock beside the trail. The figure appeared again, standing at the edge, motionless. My mind raced with every possible explanation, an illusion, hypothermia, a hallucination brought on by isolation, but the presence felt tangible, deliberate. My instincts screamed to run, yet the fear was heavy, almost paralytic, anchoring me to the spot. I watched as the figure shifted, sliding closer, and I noticed a strange pattern in the way the fog wrapped around it, almost like it was part of it, moving as if the mist itself were a cloak. Night fell without warning. The fog thickened, swallowing the little light left behind. I stumbled through the dense whiteness, my flashlight beam flickering over trees and rocks that seemed to change position, growing taller, closer. Every sound, branches snapping, distant water, the rush of wind, was amplified and distorted, each note carrying an uncanny rhythm, like the forest was speaking in riddles. I felt a deep penetrating awareness, as if the ridge, the creek, and the fog itself had their eyes on me. I could not see the figure, yet its presence lingered, a constant pressure against my senses, reminding me I was not alone. Hours dragged into an uncertain eternity. I wandered, trying to keep my bearings, but the trail no longer felt familiar. The creek twisted unpredictably, trees leaned at impossible angles, and the fog obscured everything, making the hollow seem infinite. At one point, I thought I heard my name whispered along the wind, soft and distorted, echoing from a place that shouldn't exist. I froze, straining to locate the source, but the fog swallowed it, leaving only a lingering sense of menace. My flashlight revealed glimpses of movement, branches bending as if brushed by invisible hands, shadows stretching impossibly across the forest floor, but never a full form. By the time dawn broke, the fog began to thin, light seeping in pale and diffuse. The figure had vanished, leaving nothing but the damp, twisted trail and the lingering weight of its presence. I emerged from the hollow, exhausted and shaken, my mind replaying every detail, every impossible movement, every whispered sound. The forest looked normal again, but I knew better. The fog had revealed something I could not name, something patient, deliberate, and entirely beyond my understanding. Even now, years later, I cannot walk along Raven Creek without feeling the memory press against me. The forest seems heavier in certain spots, shadows deeper, and the fog, though rare, is never harmless. I have returned many times, alone and with other rangers, and the figure never appeared again. Yet the memory of it lingers, a constant reminder that the mountains hide more than terrain. They hide presence, awareness, and patience. The ridge and the creek hold secrets that cannot be mapped, measured, or understood. The fog hides more than just the trail. It hides something that should not exist. Waiting, observing, slipping through the world, just out of reach, leaving only those it touches with a memory that chills, confounds, and never truly lets go. That summer evening, I decided to take a lesser-known trail to inspect some old ranger posts I hadn't checked in months. The sun was already low behind the ridges when I arrived at the trailhead, and the forest was quiet, too quiet. Usually, even in the heat of summer, you'd hear the faint rustle of small animals, the call of birds preparing to roost, insects droning in the underbrush. But that day, none of it was there. The air felt thick, almost damp with anticipation, and the path ahead twisted sharply through the trees, narrow and uneven. The markers I expected to guide me along the trail were missing, faded by time or perhaps removed entirely. I shrugged it off at first, chalking it up to neglect, and started down the path, my boots crunching against dry leaves and loose dirt. At first, the trail seemed straightforward enough, winding gently along the slope, the forest gradually closing overhead. But soon I noticed something odd. The turns of the path felt unnatural. A bend I had taken earlier seemed to loop back almost imperceptibly, and I started to catch glimpses of familiar trees in positions that should have been behind me. I pulled out my GPS, expecting to see my location plotted clearly against the ridge lines I knew. But the device offered nothing, only an endless expanse of green, a gridless void of forest, with no trail markers, no clear reference points. I shook my head, blaming the weak signal, though deep down I knew the forest wasn't behaving normally. Hours seemed to pass quickly, though the fading light suggested more time had gone by. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching across the undergrowth in ways that made the slope appear steeper, the valleys deeper. I tried retracing my steps, hoping to find a landmark I recognized, but every tree looked identical. Every slope mirrored the last. It was disorienting. I could feel the path twisting under my feet as though the trail itself had shifted, bending in ways that made no sense. I called into my radio for backup, but only static responded, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through my chest. The forest felt alive in a way I could not define. Patient, deliberate, observing. Night fell faster than it should have, the darkness pressing against the trail, dense and absolute. My flashlight offered little relief. The beam cut only a few feet ahead, revealing twisted roots, dense underbrush, and the faint outline of trees that seemed too tall, too close, too identical. I stumbled over a rock and cursed under my breath, my voice returning strangely muffled in the quiet. I realized then that I had no idea which direction would lead me back to the main trailhead. Panic started to edge into my mind, but I tried to steady my breathing. I had been alone in the mountains before, and while it had always been unsettling, I had never felt this degree of disorientation, this impossible sense of wrongness. That's when I saw it. A faint light, far ahead, flickering weakly between the trees. It was warm, golden, like a lantern held in the hands of someone moving along the trail. Relief washed over me. A hiker, I told myself. perhaps a late wanderer who had gotten lost. I ran toward it, adrenaline surging, desperate for human contact, for the reassurance of presence. But the light seemed to retreat faster than I could approach, flickering in the distance, refusing to resolve into a tangible form. My flashlight cut over the spot, illuminating nothing but the same endless forest, the same repetitive shadows. I stumbled again, calling out, but the light vanished entirely, leaving only the unbroken darkness ahead. I slowed, breathing heavily, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. The path remained disorienting, the turns unnatural, the trail markers non-existent. I attempted to keep moving, scanning for any feature that might signal a recognizable landmark, a rock formation, a bend in a stream, a fallen log. But each feature seemed identical to the last, and I began to feel the oppressive weight of time stretched unnaturally, as though hours had become days in the silence of the forest. The forest was patient. I felt it observing me, testing me, guiding me along a path it had already chosen. Exhaustion set in, my muscles aching, every step heavy with fear and uncertainty. I debated sitting down, waiting for dawn, but the thought of stopping, of being fully immersed in the dark and disorienting forest, was unbearable. Every shadow seemed to twitch at the edges of my vision, fleeting glimpses of movement that disappeared when I tried to focus. I thought I heard whispers, low murmurs carried by the wind, indecipherable but urgent. I spun, flashlight swinging wildly, but nothing appeared. The silence returned, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves that might have been wind, or might have been something moving toward me. Hours dragged into an indistinct eternity. The forest seemed to close in on me, pressing against my ears, my chest, my eyes. The trail no longer made sense, curving back on itself in ways I could not have imagined. And then, faintly, I saw the light again, glowing just beyond the next bend. This time I moved cautiously, not running, trying to see the source clearly. But when I reached the spot, there was nothing. No lantern, no hiker, no figure of any kind, just the empty trail stretching into the thick darkness and fog that had begun to settle along the creek below. Desperation clawed at me. I tried retracing the path I thought I had taken, but each tree, each shadow, each rise of the ground looked identical to the one before. My GPS offered no relief. The device displayed only a blank screen, no trail, no coordinates, no reassurance. I realized then that I had wandered into a space that was not mapped, not intended for navigation. A space between the known forest and something else. The forest was no longer just a collection of trees, streams, and rocks. It had become a living puzzle, bending around me, guiding me deeper into the unknown. I stumbled over roots, scraped my hands along bark, and called out into the darkness. My own voice seemed to vanish, swallowed by the heavy air, returning only as a distorted echo. Every step brought the sensation of being followed, of eyes tracking my movements from somewhere unseen. I could feel the weight of the forest around me, patient, deliberate, a pressure that was physical and mental at the same time. Shadows stretched and merged with the mist that had begun to creep along the path, curling around trees and rocks like smoke, enveloping me in disorientation and fear. By the time I finally recognized a familiar formation, a bend in the creek I had once passed on another patrol, I was trembling, sweat and cold clinging to my skin. The path had returned to something recognizable, yet I could not shake the sensation that the trail had led me somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that existed outside the normal rules of the forest, a place that should not exist on any map. The light, the flicker, the repetition of trees and slopes, it had all been real and unreal simultaneously. I walked slowly, head down, until I finally reached the main trailhead, where my truck sat quietly, the radio still humming in the faint breeze. Even now, years later, I can feel the memory of that trail pressing against me. On quiet summer evenings, when the forest is still and the wind is low, I remember the flickering light, the impossible loops of the path, the weight of the trees pressing closer than they should. The trail that led nowhere is not just a misstep in navigation. It is a place where the mountains fold over themselves, where the forest watches and waits, where something beyond comprehension lingers, patient and deliberate. I tell myself the forest hides no malice, only its secrets. But the memory of that night reminds me that the woods have their own rules, their own logic, and that sometimes, even the most experienced eyes cannot perceive the paths that exist between the places we know. I've patrolled the ridges and hollows of the Blue Ridge for years, and I've seen my share of the forest's quiet menace, but nothing unsettled me quite like the ridge where the campers vanished decades ago. The story had always been whispered in the station. 4 friends, summer outing, gone without a trace. Search parties scoured the area, but the mountain seemed to swallow them whole, leaving only rumors and the memory of their laughter drifting through the pines. One evening, while following the ridge's old patrol route, I stumbled across what remained of their campsite. The forest had claimed it almost entirely. Trees and underbrush grew through the perimeter where the tents had once stood, the fabric shredded and decayed. The fire pit was cold, its stones blackened by long-forgotten flames. I thought I had arrived at a forgotten patch of woods, a relic of years gone by, and yet the air felt different, charged with the kind of presence you can feel in your bones. I stepped carefully into the clearing, scanning the area with my flashlight. The shadows of the trees stretched long in the dying light, leaning inward like sentries. I could see faint imprints of where the campers had once walked, depressions in the earth overrun by moss and weeds, and I noticed small items half swallowed by the forest. A rusted cooking pot, fragments of a tent pole, and a tangle of cordage. My boots crunched softly against the leaves, but I felt every step as though the clearing itself was watching, waiting. And then I heard it, the faintest sound of laughter, high-pitched, fleeting, impossibly distant. My pulse quickened, I froze. It wasn't carried by the wind. It didn't seem to have a source. The sound floated across the clearing, delicate, playful, but with an undertone that made the hairs on my arms rise. I called out, my voice harsh in the quiet forest. "Hello, anyone here?" The echo of my words returned almost immediately, warped by the trees and the terrain, but there was no answer beyond that. And yet the sounds continued, footsteps around me, light and quick, moving through the dead leaves, circling the campsite. I swung my flashlight, searching for any sign of life, but the clearing remained empty. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps animals had disturbed the debris, or the wind shifted in strange ways along the ridge. But instinct told me otherwise. The energy of that place was deliberate, patient, observing. The forest was replaying something, and I had walked straight into it. The sun began to set, spilling orange and pink across the horizon. Shadows deepened, stretching longer, separating themselves from the trees, moving in ways that defied physics. I watched in growing unease as one shadow slithered along the ground, detached from any visible source, circling the campsite as if tracing the steps of campers long gone. I could hear whispers then, faint at first, murmuring names I didn't recognize. The voices were soft, overlapping, coming from all directions at once, echoing off the nearby slopes. I shouted again, but all that answered me was my own voice, bouncing back, distorted, like it had been twisted through some hidden chamber within the ridge. I kept moving slowly, flashlight sweeping the area, every sense heightened. The shadows continued their silent procession, weaving between trees, across the old fire pit, around the remnants of the tents. Occasionally I thought I caught glimpses of movement just beyond the edge of the beam, forms bending and twisting into shapes that resembled the campers themselves, yet never fully forming. The laughter, once distant, grew closer, surrounding me now. I could feel it pressing against my mind, insistent, teasing, taunting. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears louder than it should have. The temperature dropped quickly, as if the ridge itself exhaled cold air, creeping along my collar and down my spine. I noticed that the forest around the clearing seemed to move differently in the fading light. Branches shifted without wind, leaves fluttered, though the air was still. Something was rewriting the space around me, bending it to the memory of that night long ago. I stayed rooted in the center of the clearing, afraid to move yet unable to look away. I felt eyes on me, countless unseen observers watching, hidden behind trees and shadows, their gaze patient, endless. Hours passed. The sky deepened to a deep bruised purple. The whispers and laughter ebbed and flowed, sometimes just at the edge of hearing, sometimes closer, urgent, carrying a tone that I couldn't interpret. I realized that the campsite wasn't empty. It never had been. The forest itself was enacting a memory, a loop, and I was intruding on it. I tried to step away, back toward the trail I had followed, but the clearing seemed to stretch unnaturally, the slope elongating, the ridge bending. I couldn't find the same path I had used to approach. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, scanning for any familiar tree, any rock, any feature that could guide me out. I found myself by the old fire pit again, staring at its cold stones. I could see footprints forming around it, impressions that hadn't existed before, soft and fleeting. I followed them carefully, moving clockwise, and the whispers shifted, reacting to my movement. Occasionally a laugh would rise sharply, breaking into the quiet, then fade, leaving a ringing in my ears. I called out one last time, desperation in my voice, asking whoever, or whatever, was there to show itself, to acknowledge me. Silence followed, but it was heavy, dense, alive, filled with unspoken awareness. By the time dawn approached, the sounds diminished, though not entirely. The shadows became less pronounced as light filtered into the clearing, but the memory of the night remained thick in the air. The laughter, the whispers, the ghostly steps, they had left a residue, an imprint that no sunlight could erase. I finally stepped away from the clearing, heading toward familiar terrain, every step heavy with fatigue and dread. The forest seemed normal again, but I knew better. The ridge was patient. It held on to its memories and replayed them, allowing glimpses to those who came close, like a ghost of a night that had never fully ended. Even after returning to the ranger station, the echo of that place haunted me. On quiet evenings, when the wind shifts and the pines sway gently, I can hear it, the faint laughter, soft footsteps, and whispers that carry the names of people I will never know. I have returned to the ridge many times since, alone and with colleagues, and the clearing remains half swallowed by the forest. Tents shredded and fire pit cold, but I never feel the same pressure, the same closeness, the same presence. And yet I know the memory of those campers, and the ridge that claimed them is patient, waiting for the next person to stumble upon it, to witness the forest itself playing back a moment in time that refuses to die. Even now, years later, the echoes follow me in the quiet hours. I wake in the night to the sound of distant laughter or the soft crunch of leaves under invisible feet. The ridge, the campsite, and the vanished campers linger in my mind, a reminder that the Blue Ridge holds more than terrain and wildlife. It preserves memory, and sometimes those memories are more real than the living, more insistent than any sound we expect, more unsettling than the dark itself. The forest waits, patient, indifferent, but aware, replaying a night long gone, yet never forgotten. And for anyone who comes close, the echoes are enough to make the blood run cold. I've spent years patrolling the ridges and hollows of the Blue Ridge, and I thought I knew every hidden path, every old trail, every long-forgotten clearing. But that summer afternoon, while performing a solo inspection of an old fire lookout route, I stumbled across something that unsettled me in a way nothing else ever had. A cabin I had never seen before. The structure was small, wooden, and strangely neat, almost pristine, tucked between towering pines on a gentle slope that should have been familiar. Its exterior looked cared for, the paint faded but intact, the roof unbroken, the windows clear, yet the absence of smoke or movement gave it a haunting stillness. It was as if someone had built it yesterday and vanished, leaving it waiting. I paused at the edge of the clearing, flashlight in hand, heart picking up pace despite the bright day. The door opened easily, creaking softly. Inside, everything was in order. A simple desk, a chair tucked neatly, shelves holding jars and tools that looked recently used. But the air was thick with an unplaceable presence. Dust lay in thin layers, but the cabin felt alive, like it was holding its breath. On the desk, a journal lay open, its pages filled with careful handwriting. The last entries caught my attention immediately. They spoke of something watching from the pines, shadows moving at the periphery, and sounds that whispered even when the wind was still. My pulse quickened as I read, the words echoing the unease pressing around me. The fireplace smelled faintly of smoke, though the embers had long since gone cold. There was no warmth, no recent sign of life, and yet the air around it felt charged, like the cabin itself was aware I had entered. I set down my pack and tried to steady my breathing. The afternoon light streamed through the windows, yet shadows clung to the corners, long and deliberate. I explored carefully, touching the walls, inspecting the shelves, checking for any clue of who might have been there or where they had gone. Everything was in place, yet there was something wrong, something unquantifiable. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight, the sound echoing strangely, like the cabin stretched in ways my eyes could not perceive. I felt watched, though there was no one. And then I saw it in the corner of my vision. A subtle shift, a twitch of shadow, as if the cabin itself were breathing. I spun, but nothing was there. That night, I made the decision to stay. I laid a blanket on the floor near the fireplace, though I dared not light it, fearing the smoke would attract attention from whatever presence lingered. The first hours were restless. Every noise, the wind against the siding, the creak of a distant branch, the rustle of leaves, felt exaggerated, amplified in the silence of the enclosed space. Then the dreams began. I could not tell where sleep ended and the cabin's influence began. In the dream, the room stretched impossibly, walls curving and folding, the windows elongating like eyes. The journal on the desk turned its pages on its own, words shifting and rearranging. Whispered phrases tickled my ears in a language I almost understood, a cadence of warning I couldn't fully grasp. I woke suddenly, sweat running down my back, convinced I could hear footsteps above. Though I had confirmed earlier the loft had no floor, I tried to rationalize it. Exhaustion, isolation, the brain playing tricks. But the cabin would not allow calm. The shadows moved subtly, stretching across the floor, crawling along the walls when I wasn't looking directly at them. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes on me, tracking every movement. The journal had shifted overnight, a page flipped, though I had not touched it. I read the words again. They no longer matched the entries I remembered. Phrases I hadn't seen before appeared, written in a trembling hand. You are not alone. You never were. My stomach churned as the room seemed to contract, the walls tilting inward slightly, as if testing the boundaries of my perception. Sleep returned in short, uneasy bursts. In the dream, the cabin expanded again, doors opening onto forests that should not exist, hallways stretching into endless pines. I could hear voices, faint and indistinct, repeating my own name, calling, beckoning. I awoke gasping each time, the floor beneath me solid and unyielding, yet the residue of the dream lingered in the corners of my mind. I paced the room quietly, running my hand along the walls, trying to anchor myself in the familiar. Outside, the forest seemed too still, the pines unnaturally patient, watching. I tried my radio. Static, nothing more. I called out, but the sound seemed to dissolve into the cabin itself. Morning came slowly, the light soft and filtered, yet the cabin had changed. It seemed smaller, toy-like in scale, like the previous night had exaggerated its presence and the sun had shrunk it back to mundane reality. But the journal remained exactly where I had left it. I dared not touch it. The words seemed to shift even under the daylight, almost teasing comprehension, almost revealing secrets. I could not stay another night. The feeling of being observed, of the cabin's awareness pressing against my senses, was suffocating. I packed quickly and left, every sense alert. The ridge outside looked normal, but my heart still raced, my boots crunching over familiar paths that now felt alien. I looked back once at the cabin. It stood quietly, untouched, and yet I knew it was alive in a way I could not define. I do not return there, though I have patrolled the area many times since. Other rangers' colleagues sometimes ask about that spot, but I warn them off. There is nothing obvious to see, nothing marked on the maps, yet the memory of the cabin and the knowledge of its strange sentience remains vivid in my mind. Even years later, I dream of that cabin. The walls shift, the shadows stretch, and the whispers return, calling, observing. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear footsteps pacing in the small room, or a chair scraping softly across the floor. The journal, I remember clearly, remains in that empty space, always open, always waiting, as if it were aware that one day I would return to read what it has to tell. The cabin is patient, enduring, a sentinel of the ridge, keeping memories of those who pass through and those who never leave. And though I have walked away, I know it continues to watch, continues to wait, alive in its own unearthly way, indifferent to the passage of time, yet aware of all who dare to enter. I've walked the ridges and hollows of the Blue Ridge for years, and I thought I knew most of the whispers the forest carried. The wind through the pines, the distant calls of animals, the creaks of old branches settling under their own weight. But one ridge changed all of that. A place my colleagues warned me about, yet one I felt compelled to investigate on a solo patrol. They said hikers had reported hearing screaming there late at night. Sharp, high-pitched, impossible to place. Skeptical, I had brushed it off as imagination, wind, or perhaps the echoes of far-off animals. That evening, I found myself walking toward the ridge as the sun dipped low, the air cooling rapidly, shadows stretching across the trail like fingers. The forest was quiet at first, too quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your skin crawl. As dusk deepened, a scream ripped through the trees, sudden and shrill, cutting through the quiet like a blade. My blood ran cold. It was human in quality, terrifyingly so. Yet something about it felt unnatural, amplified, distorted. My pulse hammered in my chest as I turned, trying to locate the source. But the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. Above, below, behind, ahead. An impossible layering that made it impossible to pinpoint. I swallowed hard, gritting my teeth, and started toward the ridge, each step deliberate, cautious, boots sinking into soft soil littered with pine needles. The scream rose again, closer, and then darted to another direction. Like a living entity teasing me, daring me to follow, I called into the forest, my voice harsh and shaky, but the echo returned warped and delayed, distorted through the trees. I felt the shadows around me shift, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Dark shapes flickered through the pines, too quick to be human, moving with a speed and purpose that made no sense. I strained my eyes, heart hammering, trying to see what was moving, but the trees seemed to bend around it, hiding and revealing, stretching the space unnaturally. Each time I thought I might be catching up to the source, the scream would change pitch, swing to the opposite side of the ridge, impossible to locate, impossible to comprehend. The forest floor itself seemed alive, vibrating beneath my boots, subtle at first, like the hum of an approaching storm, then stronger, resonating in rhythm with the screaming. My hands shook as I gripped my flashlight, sweeping over roots and fallen branches, yet finding nothing. I stumbled over a hidden root and cursed under my breath, but the momentary sound of my voice was swallowed by the stillness, leaving only the scream, echoing, persistent and alive. I realized then that this place wasn't just haunted by sound. It was something more. The ridge itself seemed to carry memory, anguish, a weight that had nothing to do with the living. I tried to move faster, seeking the trail I had taken to approach the ridge, but every turn seemed unfamiliar. The forest had shifted subtly while I was distracted, as though the trees themselves were rearranging, bending to the logic of the ridge, guiding me deeper. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing glimpses of shapes that mimicked human forms, tall and thin, dissolving into the night when I blinked or looked directly at them. Every so often the scream would stop for a fraction of a second, leaving only silence so heavy it pressed against my chest. And then it would start again, louder, more piercing, closer, yet still impossible to locate. I called my radio, desperate for backup, for a voice from outside, something to ground me in reality. Only static responded, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the forest and through me. I shouted, screamed even, trying to impose my presence on the ridge, but my words disappeared immediately, as though the trees were swallowing sound. My own footsteps sounded exaggerated, reverberating unnaturally. I stumbled over a fallen log, catching myself, heart racing, breath ragged. The shadows at the tree line seemed to pulse in rhythm with the screams, shifting in patterns I could not track, circling me, folding in and out of existence. Time lost meaning. The sun dipped entirely below the horizon, leaving a dark, bruised sky over the ridge. I stopped moving for a moment, trying to listen, trying to rationalize what I was experiencing. The scream returned, high-pitched, sustained, terrifyingly human, yet stretched into something alien. I could hear multiple layers, some screams overlapping others, as if a crowd was trapped just out of sight. I felt my stomach turn, every instinct screaming at me to retreat, yet a part of me was compelled to understand, to see, to know. The ridge itself seemed to feed off attention, aware that I was present, aware that I was listening, drawing me into its impossible geometry, into its weight of suffering. Shadows continued to move at the edges of perception, not attached to trees, not following logic. I could sense them behind me, flanking me, hovering just beyond the circle of my flashlight's beam. I spun repeatedly, trying to catch a glimpse, but they dissolved each time, leaving only the vibrating, living scream. I realized with a growing sense of dread that the ridge itself was alive. Not alive in the sense of trees and wildlife, but in a way that could feel, could express, could suffer. It seemed to speak in a language of sound and vibration, a testimony to anguish that no human being could endure and survive intact. The screams shifted, faster now, darting from side to side, rising and falling in pitch, until I could no longer discern any pattern. I fell to my knees, pressing my palms against the cold earth, trying to ground myself, trying to breathe through the fear. The vibration in the ground intensified, and I realized with horror that it matched the rhythm of the screams. The ridge was resonating, the very soil trembling in harmony with the suffering it carried. I could feel it through my bones, a physical pressure that made every movement laborious, every breath shallow. I felt smaller, diminished, insignificant under the sheer weight of the ridge's presence. I forced myself to stand, moving slowly, carefully, each step calculated, following a path I barely understood. The screams fluctuated with my movement, never allowing me to settle, never allowing me to understand. I thought I saw a form, perhaps human, darting across a clearing ahead, and I moved toward it, thinking maybe it was a lost hiker, or perhaps a remnant, a trace of whatever had made these mountains howl. But when I arrived, the space was empty. The clearing was normal, undisturbed, except for the lingering echo in my mind. The scream followed me, persistent, a living thing in my imagination, or perhaps a living thing in the forest itself. Eventually, fear outweighed curiosity, and I turned back, retreating toward the trailhead. Each step I took seemed slower than the last, the ridge stretching in impossible ways, turning familiar slopes into new alien angles. Shadows leapt ahead of me, and the scream continued, sometimes soft, sometimes tearing the night in sudden bursts. I didn't stop to look. I kept moving, boots scraping over rocks and roots, heart hammering, breath shallow and rapid. The forest seemed to bend around me, compressing space, delaying my escape. And I realized that this was not a place meant to be traversed lightly. By the time I reached a familiar bend in the main trail, the sky was completely dark. The screams had faded slightly, but the vibration lingered in the ground beneath me, subtle yet insistent. I glanced back once at the ridge, the trees appearing almost normal in the distance, yet I knew better. The forest carried memory, and the ridge held suffering, a chorus of voices no human could comprehend fully, a living entity expressing anguish beyond explanation. I walked the last stretch quickly, reaching my vehicle, hands trembling as I clutched the steering wheel. Even as I drove away, the echo followed me, a persistent rhythm in my skull, insistent and alive. That night, and in the nights after, I could not shake the scream. Sometimes in my dreams I return to the ridge, the same high-pitched, impossible sound, the vibrations through the earth, the shadow forms at the periphery of vision. I wake sweating, heartbeat hammering, and for a moment I can still hear it, as if the ridge itself is calling, expressing pain, suffering, and warning all at once. I have returned to the area several times on patrol, but I no longer approach that ridge after dusk. It is patient, enduring, alive, and aware. The screams are not gone. They only wait, waiting for the next hiker, the next ranger, the next person foolish enough to walk where the ridge remembers, where the forest itself cries out in a language no human can fully comprehend. Even now, years later, I can feel it in quiet moments, the memory of the sound vibrating under my feet, the lingering sensation of shadows moving just beyond perception. The ridge has a consciousness, a weight of suffering, a history that defies explanation, and the scream, high-pitched, unyielding, continues to haunt me. I have come to understand that some places are not meant to be tamed, that the Blue Ridge holds secrets deeper than trails, deeper than history, and that sometimes listening is enough to know the truth. The mountains themselves remember, and sometimes they scream. I had driven that back road countless times over the years, the ribbon of asphalt winding lazily through the foothills, familiar curves, familiar trees, familiar silence. It was the kind of road where you could lose yourself in thought, the mountains pressing gently around you, shadows moving with the sun across the canopy. That evening I was making my usual rounds, checking old trailheads and patrol markers, radio humming faintly beside me. The sky was soft, the sunlight fading to gold, and for a moment, everything felt ordinary. I had no reason to suspect that what I knew so well would suddenly betray me. The change began subtly. A curve that I knew like the back of my hand seemed sharper, tighter, and the familiar pines on either side looked older, twisted differently, as if sculpted by some slow, deliberate hand. I frowned, glancing at my odometer and then the roadside markers. Nothing matched. The road should have bent gradually to the left, but now it veered sharply, and the trees felt too close, leaning inward, pressing against the windshield as I drove. I turned on the radio for a signal, some reassurance of normalcy, but it crackled, hissed, and then went dead, leaving only a low, ominous static. I twisted the dial, but every frequency returned the same. Panic rose slowly, like a rising tide, as I tried to rationalize. Perhaps a new growth had encroached, or the roadbed had shifted slightly after a storm. I tried turning the truck around, retracing my path, but the road had changed entirely. Curves I knew intimately now looped in impossible ways. Landmarks that had always guided me, the old stone wall, the solitary oak at the crest of the hill, the worn signpost, were gone or unrecognizable. The mountains themselves seemed to have shifted, the trees gnarled into grotesque shapes, their trunks warped, branches stretching like arthritic fingers toward me. Even the sunlight filtering through the canopy was dim, muted, as if the day had been drained of its warmth. I drove slowly, hands tight on the wheel, heart hammering. Every bend of the road seemed to lead me deeper into a maze of nature's making, a labyrinth that existed only for me. The air felt heavier, thick with the smell of moss, wet earth, and decay. I passed familiar landmarks that no longer felt familiar. The creek that should have curved gently to the west now rushed aggressively beside the road, dark water frothing over stones that had never been there. I caught glimpses of shadows at the periphery of the windshield, shapes shifting in ways that seemed to mock natural movement. I called into the radio again, my voice cracking with urgency, but only static returned, echoing hollowly as if amplified by unseen walls. Hours passed, or what felt like hours. Time became meaningless. The road stretched endlessly, looping in impossible ways. Hills I had driven down before now rose impossibly steep, valleys inverted themselves. I forced myself to stop at one bend, trying to orient myself, scanning the forest for any hint of something familiar, any clue to where the world had twisted. There was nothing, just the road curling into shadows, the distorted shapes of trees leaning inward, and the low hum of static from my dead radio. Every instinct screamed at me that I had entered something unnatural, a space that obeyed no rules, a corridor carved by the mountains themselves to confuse and ensnare. Finally, I spotted a structure in the distance, an old bridge, rusted and unstable, spanning a shallow gorge. Relief washed over me. Perhaps if I crossed it, I could return to familiar territory, find some semblance of normalcy. I approached cautiously, noting the rotting wood and the corroded steel, and yet it was the only apparent path forward. I crossed slowly, the bridge groaning under my truck, planks flexing ominously. Each sound echoed loudly, as if the gorge beneath amplified my presence. When I reached the other side, I braced myself, expecting new terrain, a trailhead, something recognizable. Instead, I emerged onto the very trailhead I had started from hours before. The familiar markers were in place, the signpost leaning at its usual angle, the parking area gravelly and undisturbed. My truck idled in the same spot I had left it, headlights reflecting the same sun-dappled patterns on the ground. For a moment, disbelief anchored me. I sat there, heart still racing, trying to comprehend what had happened. The road, the forest, the bridge, everything had shifted, reshaped, or perhaps had never existed as I perceived it. It was as if the mountains themselves had rearranged their paths, twisting space into loops that defied logic, preserving continuity while altering reality. I left quickly, driving past the trailhead and along the main road, unable to shake the disorientation that clung to me. Even days later, I could not bring myself to take that back road again. It lingered in my mind, every memory of curves and twisted trees amplified, the sense of impossible looping, the dead radio, the dim light pressing through unfamiliar foliage. I tried to rationalize it, fatigue, exhaustion, illusions born of long hours alone, but deep down, I knew the mountains had played a trick no human could fully understand. The ridge, the slope, the canopy, it had moved while I wasn't looking. Or perhaps it had always been waiting, patient, reshaping itself for someone foolish enough to travel it at the wrong time. At night, the memory resurfaces vividly. I dream of the road bending into itself, curves that lead nowhere, bridges that cross into the same starting point, trees that grow taller as I watch, shadows shifting unnaturally at the edges of vision. The radio's static hum echoes in my ears, persistent, alive, a sound that seems to mock my rational mind. Even now, when I drive elsewhere in the mountains, I occasionally glimpse a curve, a shadow, a glimpse of moss-covered wood, and my pulse quickens, remembering the road that did not obey logic, the forest that refused to remain fixed. The sense of being trapped in a place that was both familiar and alien. I have spoken to other rangers, hikers and locals about that stretch of back road, carefully, never mentioning the full scope of what happened. No one reports the same experience, yet I cannot shake the certainty that the mountains can rearrange themselves. That road, that night, demonstrated a geometry I could not understand. A consciousness in the land that defies reason, that preserves loops and paths known only to itself. It was a lesson in patience, observation, and fear, a reminder that the Appalachian terrain is alive, in its own way, and that sometimes it manipulates travelers not through violence, but through disorientation, bending perception until reality itself seems malleable. Even years later, I avoid that back road entirely. Sometimes I drive near its intersection and feel a twinge of dread, a pull toward the familiar curves I once knew. I catch myself imagining the trees leaning closer, the road twisting in impossible loops, the bridge reappearing, and I turn sharply, heart hammering, unwilling to tempt the mountains again. The experience left an imprint in my mind, a knowledge that the mountains are patient, aware, and capable of subtle, unnerving manipulation. They do not scream, they do not shout, they simply shift. And if you are not careful, you will wander endlessly through a landscape that obeys no rules except its own. I have learned to accept the reality of that night. The road exists somewhere between memory and imagination, between logic and instinct. The mountains may have rearranged themselves, or perhaps they always were as they appeared, waiting for me to realize the fragility of perception in the Blue Ridge. The memory is enough to keep me cautious, to remind me that familiarity can be deceiving, and that even a road driven 100 times can become something entirely alien in a single evening. The mountains are patient, eternal, and occasionally terrifyingly deliberate. Even now, when I walk in other parts of the forest, I am hyper-aware of curves, trees, and light filtering through the canopy. Every familiar path carries the potential for the impossible. The road that disappeared has become a cautionary tale in my mind, not one I speak of often, yet it shapes every patrol, every hike, every drive I take in those mountains. The memory of shifting asphalt, of dead radio static, of impossible loops, and of that rusted bridge remains vivid. A reminder that the Appalachian terrain is not static, that it can bend, twist, and disorient those who travel it, and that sometimes the world we trust to be familiar is more fluid and unknowable than we can ever comprehend. I had been patrolling the ridge for years, accustomed to the deep, almost sacred quiet of the Blue Ridge at night, when the forest takes on a presence all its own. Most nights it's a gentle stillness broken only by distant calls of owls, the whisper of wind through the pines, or the soft shuffle of nocturnal wildlife. But that night was different. From the moment I began my patrol, the air felt heavier, charged in a way I couldn't explain. Every rustle, every snap of a twig seemed deliberate, as though the forest itself were shifting around me, observing. I carried my flashlight, sweeping its narrow beam across the path and surrounding woods. The ridge is familiar to me. Every bend, every cluster of trees, every patch of rock is etched in my memory. But that night, even familiar landmarks felt alien. Shadows hung heavier than usual, clinging to the trunks and branches in ways that made me uneasy. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was just the isolation, the fatigue from a long day. And then I saw them, a pair of eyes reflecting in the beam of my flashlight. I froze immediately, heart hammering, breath caught in my throat. They were too high for a deer, too still for any normal animal I knew. I called out, voice trembling, but no sound returned except the echo of my own words. The eyes didn't blink. They remained fixed on me, unyielding, patient. I tried to move closer, but as I took a step forward, the eyes vanished, swallowed by the darkness, only to reappear a little further along, peering from behind a tree, watching, waiting. It was unnerving the way it seemed to anticipate my movements. Always just beyond reach, always just outside the beam of light. I continued along the ridge, trying to keep calm, reminding myself that it was likely some nocturnal animal, a hunter's reflection, or my mind playing tricks. But the eyes followed, silent and unblinking, tracking me for miles. Every time I paused, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The usual nocturnal sounds, frogs, insects, the wind, died down entirely, leaving only that oppressive silence, punctuated by the occasional rustle of leaves, where I could sense movement. It was as though the entire ridge had become attuned to my presence, and the watcher was its sentinel. I tested the flashlight again, sweeping the ridge in a full circle, but the eyes were always just out of reach. When I turned to change direction, they would reappear behind me, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, but never blinking, never moving in a natural manner. There was no sound, no steps, no breathing, nothing to suggest a being in the conventional sense. Just those eyes, reflecting the beam like mirrors, waiting. Panic rose slowly, curling through my stomach. I felt exposed, like the entire forest was complicit in some silent game I had not agreed to play. Hours seemed to stretch unnaturally. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, my own fatigue magnified by the constant awareness of being watched. I tried talking, reasoning with the presence. "I'm a ranger," I whispered, forcing the words into the quiet. "I mean no harm." Nothing answered. Of course, but the eyes remained, patient, unmoving, like a predator studying its prey, or perhaps an observer with no intention of intervening, simply recording, waiting for the moment I might falter. I tried to increase my pace, to reach the end of the ridge where my vehicle was parked. But the forest seemed to stretch endlessly. Every familiar curve of the trail looked unfamiliar, every cluster of rocks, every fallen tree slightly altered, as though the ridge itself had shifted, guiding me, delaying me, keeping me under observation. The eyes darted along with me, never losing focus, moving with a precision that defied normal behavior. I could not see a body, a shape, anything that explained the unnatural positioning of the eyes. And yet, the sense of being followed, measured, catalogued, never diminished. I stopped at one point, pressing myself against a tree, flashlight trembling in my hand, trying to steady my racing heartbeat. The eyes were gone, vanished, no longer in sight, but the awareness of their presence lingered, as though the air itself remembered. I waited, seconds stretching into minutes, listening to the oppressive silence. Then slowly they reappeared, higher up the slope, closer to the tree line, unblinking and indifferent. I had no choice but to move, forcing my legs to carry me forward despite the dread pressing on my chest. The further I went, the heavier the silence became. My own breathing sounded intrusive, alien. I caught glimpses of movement just at the edge of vision, but every time I turned to face it, nothing was there. The eyes were the only constant, appearing and disappearing at will, patient, unyielding, as if measuring my endurance, testing my resolve. I considered calling my colleagues, asking for backup, but my radio was useless, the usual static and weak signal absent entirely. It was as if the ridge had swallowed all connection to the outside world. Isolating me completely, I reached the lower slope, the familiar trail to my vehicle finally in sight, yet my relief was tempered by fear. I dared not glance backward, but curiosity and instinct drew my eyes. There they were, in a cluster of shadows near a fallen pine, those same reflective orbs, unblinking, patient. My stomach churned. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore them, trying to focus on the gravel path leading to my truck. Every crunch of stones beneath my boots echoed loudly in the unnatural stillness, announcing my approach. When I finally reached my vehicle, I leaned against it, chest heaving, hands gripping the roof for stability. The headlights illuminated the clearing, yet there were no eyes in sight. The forest seemed empty, unnervingly still, but I knew better. The watcher had not left. It had only disappeared from sight, retreating to its hidden vantage, patient and enduring. I hesitated, unwilling to turn back and risk making eye contact again, but instinct demanded a final glance. Slowly I pivoted, flashlight held loosely at my side. The eyes were gone. Nothing remained except the oppressive silence, heavy and suffocating. The kind that fills your ears and presses against your skull, leaving no space for relief. I drove away quickly, headlights cutting through the familiar darkness, but the memory of the eyes lingered, haunting the periphery of my mind. I replayed the night over and over, trying to rationalize it, dear, reflection, exhaustion, but each theory failed to account for the precision, the persistence, the deliberate placement of those unblinking eyes. They had followed me for miles, unseen yet undeniably present, observing with a patience that defied human comprehension. Even now, when I patrol other ridges, my thoughts drift to that night. Every shadow at the tree line, every flicker of reflective light in the distance, brings back the memory, the unease, the certainty that the ridge itself held witness to my passage. The experience left a mark deeper than physical fear. There was no threat in the conventional sense, no attack, no movement toward me, no sound beyond the stillness, but the psychological weight was immense. It is one thing to fear something visible, tangible. It is another to know without doubt that you are being observed, measured, catalogued by something entirely beyond your understanding. Patient enough to wait silently, to follow without intrusion, to leave you alive yet profoundly unsettled. The forest felt altered forever, each ridge and slope potentially harboring watchers, eyes that slip between shadow and light, existing just beyond human perception, waiting for the next patrol, the next wanderer, the next unsuspecting soul. Even years later, the memory is vivid. I wake occasionally, heart racing, convinced I see glimmers of reflection at the edges of my vision. In those moments, the mountains themselves feel aware, silent, patient. I have returned to that ridge only once, briefly, and while the eyes did not appear, I felt their absence as heavily as if they were still watching. The experience reshaped my understanding of these mountains. Familiar paths can hold the unknown. Shadows can harbor sentience. Silence can be oppressive in ways the body recognizes but the mind struggles to describe. And sometimes, even in the quietest woods, you are not alone. I have never stopped wondering what watched me that night. Waiting, patient, unseen. Was it a creature? A manifestation of the ridge itself, or some consciousness beyond human comprehension? I do not know, and perhaps I never will. But I know the feeling. The awareness of being observed in a forest that obeys no rules. The eyes that vanish and reappear at will. The suffocating stillness that presses into your mind is real. And it is enough to make you respect the mountains. Not for their beauty or solitude, but for the patient, silent intelligence that lurks just beyond the edge of vision, ever present, waiting for the next person foolish enough to walk alone at night.